Next slide.
It is now recording. Great.
So as I'm sure most of you are aware, Sierra Club is the largest grassroots environmental organization in the country with chapters in every state, Puerto Rico, and then we also have a newly minted chapter in Guam. California is a bit different in that there are 13 different chapters here in California, and you can see that on the map on the right side of the slide. They're mostly allocated by counties, but there are some counties that have 2 chapters for different administrative reasons. In the 1980s, in an effort to make sure that Sierra Club is speaking with one voice, Sierra Club California was founded as the legislative and regulatory advocacy arm for Sierra Club's 13 chapters and national in California. So we are the Sierra Club chapter that conducts legislative lobbying in the legislature, and then also regulatory lobbying and advocacy at the state level. And so if you think of it as state environmental agency, whether that's California Environmental Protection Agency, Water Resources Board, Department of Water Resources, California Energy Commission, that's the Sierra Club California is the entity that lobbies for Sierra Club at those agencies. And we do that through a number of different ways, but today we'll be talking specifically about the legislative aspects of those. Next slide, please. We have 8 different staff currently. Our staff consists of lobbyists, lawyers, organizers, scientists, communications professionals, and operations professionals who are all committed to protecting California communities, our open space, and our air and water resources as prudently as possible. And we do that in a number of ways. On this slide, you'll see our current staff. We are also hiring, so that's exciting. I will put the job postings in the chat later so you can share it with your networks. But we're really excited to grow our staff in a number of ways. And so first up today, you'll hear from Sakira Carter, who will give you a bit of a background on the California legislature and a little bit into the process, as well as Aaron Woolley, who will help do that as well. So with that, I will pass it over to Sakira.
Thanks, Brandon. Next slide, please. Thanks. Hi again, I'm Sakira. I'm the Senior Policy Advocate with Sierra Club, and I'm going to talk about the first few steps of the legislative process. The legislative timeline spans January through September, as you can see here, and we'll start off with January. Bills that were passed in the previous legislative session take effect January 1st of the following year. And then the legislature reconvenes and bills are introduced. And if you look in blue, from March to May, bills progress through the legislature, starting in the House of Origin, whether that be Assembly or the Senate. And then bills are assigned to policy committees and the Appropriations Committee. Finally, bills are brought to a floor vote, in which case the bill can either die or advance to the second house. And again, that's either the Assembly or the Senate. Next slide, please. From June to September, the bill goes through an identical process in the second house and is brought to a floor vote. And here the bill either passes or dies in the second house. And below, we've laid out various pertinent deadlines throughout the process as well. So for example, by February 17th, that's the deadline for bill introduction. And by October 14th, the governor must sign or veto bills that are passed by the legislature. And so we're going to break down this process even more so you walk away with a deeper understanding of the legislative process. Next slide, please. So first off, we'll start with bill introduction. A legislator has an idea for a bill, and then it's filed by the legislature. And it's important to know that bills are introduced by authors, but usually they have some sort of organization that sponsors the bill. And just as an FYI, Sierra Club doesn't typically sponsor bills for various reasons, which Brandon will discuss a little bit later. So there are 2 potential avenues that the bill can take after it's introduced by the legislature. The bill is either referred to a committee on the right side in blue, or the bill is not referred to a committee and it dies. And so if the bill is referred to a committee, what is a committee, right? Next slide, please. There are several types of committees in the legislature, and several of the topic-specific committees are referred to as policy committees. So for example, the Natural Resources Committee tends to review bills that are like oil and gas related bills and other topics that align with natural resources. And when the committee is ready to review and vote on the bill, the committee will have a hearing on the bill, which I'll discuss a little bit later on the next few slides. Bills typically go through several policy committees as they move through the legislature. And you can find an exhaustive list of policy committees on the California Senate and Assembly website, which I've provided in the link here. Next slide, please. So looking at this process again, leadership refers the bill to a committee, a policy committee, and the bill is then assigned to a committee for review. And then the bill is scheduled for a public hearing by the committee chairperson. But there's a middle step that has to happen before the bill is scheduled for a public hearing. First, the committee has to release what's called a legislative analysis. And so I'm going to talk about what a legislative analysis is on the next slide. Next slide, please. So before the public hearing occurs, the committee has to release what's called a legislative analysis. A legislative analysis explains current law, what the bill will do, background information, and the legislative team's analysis of the bill. And so on the left-hand side here, this is just a quick snapshot of a bill analysis. This particular analysis is about insufficient pipeline standards for carbon dioxide pipes. And so it's related to carbon capture and storage. And I think it's a really good example of a bill analysis. It was written by Lawrence Lingblom. And so that's what a bill analysis would look like. On the right-hand side, how do you find a bill analysis? You can go to leginfo.legislator.ca.gov. And in the second step, you can search for the bill. And then in the third step, you can click on bill analysis, which is at the top of the screen. It's a tab that says bill analysis, and that'll show you a list of bill analyses that are associated with that bill. Next slide, please. Before I continue, though, I do want to say that legislative analyses are incredibly important because they help us determine the necessity of the bill, right? So if you have existing law or other policies that already address the bill that's being proposed, then the committee may be less inclined to vote for that bill. Also, legislative analyses are important because they highlight any shortcomings of the bill, like has the legislator considered certain aspects of their proposal in terms of financial feasibility? Are they making large assumptions, or do they need to conduct more research? All of these things should be considered. Also, these analyses are important because they help the committee inform their vote. So going back to this process, just reiterating it again, leadership refers the bill to a committee. The bill is assigned to a committee for review, policy committee, and then the bill is scheduled for a public hearing, and that's in orange. So what happens during this committee hearing, right? So during the committee hearing, the author presents the bill to the committee, and then the committee will ask for testimony from lead witnesses in support of the bill. Lead witnesses are individuals that know a lot about the bill and the research behind the bill as well. So you can think of lead witnesses as like subject matter experts on that bill. After the lead witnesses explain why they support the bill, committee attendees in support of the bill are asked to give me toos in support, and committee attendees in opposition of the bill are also asked to give me toos. Then the committee will ask the lead witness questions, and finally the committee will vote on the bill, or will either advance or it will die. So for example, I attended the committee hearing for SB 1137, which is a bill that establishes a 3,200-foot buffer between schools, daycares, hospitals, and community centers, and oil and gas activities. And in this hearing, and I believe it was with Natural Resources, the bill author introduced the bill and discussed the importance of implementing a setback. And then the committee asked the lead witnesses, who in this case was Dan Ress, an attorney with the Center for Race, Poverty, and Environment, to answer questions about the bill from committee members. Then the committee asked committee attendees, like myself, to go up to the mic and say, me too, if I supported the bill, and those in opposition followed the same procedure. Finally, the committee came to a vote, and as some of you may know, SB 1137 passed that policy committee. Next slide, please. So after a bill goes through the appropriate policy committees, it must also successfully pass the Appropriations Committee. The Appropriations Committee reviews all bills that have a fiscal impact, so bills that will have a substantial expenditure of state money, bills that appropriate money, or bills that will impact the revenue of the state. But the Appropriations Committee can be very political and doesn't always necessarily focus on just the fiscal impact of the bill. So depending on political relationships, some bills may or may not successfully pass the Appropriations Committee. Another shortfall of the Appropriations Committee is that it's the least public-facing committee. So some bills will get passed without any obvious justification. So there really could be more transparency in this committee. And now I will pass it to Erin, who will explain what happens to the bill after it successfully passes both the policy committees and the appropriations committees.
Thank you, Sakira. So once a bill has successfully made it through the relevant policy committees and the appropriations process, if it has to go there, it will go to the floor where it has to be voted on by the entire membership of the House. This is what's called a floor vote. Before the third reading, they will release an updated bill analysis for each bill. The floor analysis is similar to the committee analysis that Sakira talked about, and it's prepared by the policy committee staff. It'll include a summary of the bill, any amendments, comments by the committee staff, the author, and arguments in support or opposition of the bill. If the bill has gone through appropriations, it'll also include comments about any potential fiscal impacts of the bill. And then it will also include all of the votes from each of the committees that the bill had to go through. So on what's called the third reading, the author of the bill can bring it up for a vote by the full House. Most bills need a simple majority to pass. So in the Assembly, which has 80 members, a bill will need 41 votes. And in the Senate, which has 40 members, the bill will need 21 votes to pass. A member can either vote for a bill, against a bill, or they can abstain. But in either case, the bill will need the majority of votes in favor. All bills have to pass through the first House by the deadline. This year, that deadline is June 2nd. And while a bill can be brought up for vote at any time after it moved through all of the necessary committees, most bills don't make it to the floor vote until just before the deadline. A really non-controversial bill without any fiscal impacts might move really quickly, but this is very rare. Most bills are voted on in the last few days, which are actually reserved in the legislative calendar for floor session. Legislators will meet during this time to vote and negotiate on each other's bills. And any bills that pass before the deadline will move into the second House, which we'll discuss next. Next slide, please. So after a bill makes it through the first House, it repeats the entire process in the second House. So it'll be referred to one or more policy committees. Any bill that's not referred dies, and each committee will prepare its own analysis of the bill, and the chair will hopefully schedule a hearing for the bill to be voted on by the committee. Any bills, again, that are not scheduled for a hearing will die. And then at each hearing, the committee will hear from the author, hear arguments in support or opposition of the bill, and interested parties can comment their support or opposition as well. Bills that don't pass out of the committees also die. Again, fiscal bills will go through the appropriations process in the second House. And once a bill makes it through all the committees, it'll return to the floor in the second House for the vote by the entire House. In the second House, there's usually more time that's reserved in the legislative calendar for floor sessions, usually a little more than a week. But again, most bills are voted on in the few days leading up to the deadline for the legislature to pass all bills. This year, that deadline is September 14th. During those last few days, legislators will negotiate amongst themselves among which bills they're going to pass. At any time throughout this process, the author or the members of committees can make amendments to a bill, including on the floor. And if a bill gets amended in the second House, it has to go back to the first House for a concurrence vote. So the first House has to bring the bill up again for a floor vote to concur in the amendments that were made in the second House, and the bill will need another majority vote to pass. And this all has to happen before the deadline, which is September 14th. If a bill makes it through the legislature, that's the end of the legislative piece, and it'll go to the governor. Next slide, please. So the final step is that the bill gets sent to the governor, who has to either approve or veto a bill before the deadline. For bills that are passed at the end of the legislative session, the governor has 30 days to make decisions, but otherwise the governor will only have 12 days. The governor can either sign the bill, approve it without signing, so they just let the deadline run, or they'll veto a bill. After the bill has passed the legislature and get sent to the governor, interested parties, including organizations like Sierra Club, can send letters to the governor's office to inform them of the arguments in favor or opposition to a bill. So we'll continue to advocate for bills that we take positions on after they leave the legislature. And then once the governor has made their decision, if it's a veto, they will usually include a veto message with the announcement, and those are released publicly and can be viewed online. That is the end of the process for policy bills. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the budget. So next slide, please. The budget process is separate from the process for policy bills to become law. So I'm going to take us through this timeline really quickly. So before January 10th of each year, the governor has to announce their budget proposal for the next fiscal year, which runs from July 1st to June 30th of the following year. The January budget proposal is based on the projected budget and gets revised later on in the year as more information becomes available. The governor's office will release a summary of the budget with any major expenditures or cuts, highlighted and organized by topic. The Legislative Analyst's Office will also publish a series of reports that reviews the governor's proposal in the weeks following the announcement. After the governor announces the budget proposal in January, it gets introduced in each house as identical budget bills. Each house has its own budget committee, and each budget committee has subcommittees that cover different issues. Starting around March of each year, each of the subcommittees will hold hearings to review the governor's budget and discuss any alternatives. They'll typically hear from the Department of Finance, the Legislative Analyst's Office, and any other interested parties at these hearings. By May 14th of each year, the governor has to announce a revised budget. This is called the May Revise. This accounts for the updated revenue information and any changes to the budget proposal in light of feedback from the legislature or other parties. After this announcement, the legislature has a few weeks to consider those changes before coming up with the final budget. Each house will release a revised budget bill, which might include changes recommended by subcommittees based on the outcomes of those hearings and any other factors they want to consider. Both houses and the governor have to resolve any differences in their budget proposals and come up with one unified budget bill for each house to pass prior to the June 15th deadline. Like any other bill, the budget bill is voted on the floor by each house, but they don't go through policy committees, unlike the policy bills that we discussed earlier. Sometimes the legislature and the governor can't come to an agreement before the deadline, so they might pass a budget bill by the June 15th deadline and then make revisions or add more details later on in the process. Those bills also have to pass before the end of the legislative session, so the same deadline that we previously discussed to pass all bills in September. The last note I want to make is about budget trailer bills. These are bills that include any statutory changes that are needed to be made in order to enact the budget bill. These can be really similar to a policy bill, but they don't go through the policy committees or that process that we previously discussed, even though they can make significant changes to law. So we track these bills really carefully and engage on them whenever necessary. That is the end of the bill process. So I'm going to pass it back to Brandon, who's going to talk about our advocacy.
Thanks so much, Erin and Sakira, for that really in-depth outline about how the legislature works. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Sierra Club does specifically in relationship to that, and then we'll talk about how you all can get more engaged in our process as well. So throughout the legislative timeline that Aaron and Sakira just talked about, there are a lot of opportunities for the public and lobbyists and advocates to engage, and we do that in a number of ways. So the first point is, first, once bills are introduced, our advocates analyze all of the bills that are related to the environment. So if there's a bill that is even touching a de minimis part of the environment, that is pulled up in our capital track system, and our advocates then use a number of resources to analyze that bill. What are the resources that we use? That there are a number of different ones. We take into account Sierra Club national policy positions, and so what nationally where does Sierra Club stand on this issue? If we can't get an answer from that, then we look to some California Conservation Committee resolutions. We also take into consideration the positioning of key allies, and so what are environmental justice groups and our equity partners thinking about this bill? How are they affected by this bill? What do the experts on our issue committees have to say? And so, like our Energy and Climate Committee, our Water Committee, our Wildlife Committee, as well as if there's a bill related to a specific locale, we'll go to the local chapter and ask for their input on how this bill would affect them. We also look at the political context of the bill, right? And so sometimes there are statement bills that have no chance of passing whatsoever, but it's really important for us to support. We note that. Or there are really bad bills that have no chance of passing, but we need to make sure that they're not even, considered. So we do need to oppose those or something like that. We take into consideration all of these things, and then we wrap that up into a recommendation. Our staff recommend either support, oppose, neutral, or just watching positions to the California Legislative Committee, who approves all of our positions by looking at those recommendations and the information that we just provided. So the Legislative Committee is a group of Sierra Club members and volunteers who are experts in different issue areas. We have water experts, we have toxics experts, we have parks experts, energy and climate experts, and things of that nature, where we send them different bills throughout the year and then ask for their input and their analysis as well, and then form a recommendation, and then they approve that recommendation, and then we start advocating on that. Once a year, we meet in March, usually after the bill introduction deadline. We meet to go over every single bill that we've analyzed and our recommendation for that bill. That usually takes about a day, and then throughout the rest of the legislative session, we conduct our correspondence via email and Zoom or Google Hangout, and have meetings accordingly. The Legislative Committee also dives into a little bit around endorsements and appointments, but that's irrelevant for purposes of this webinar, but just wanted to highlight that. The Legislative Committee also approves how high of a priority each bill is to Sierra Club's mission. And our priorities are based on a number of factors in addition to our position, based on a number of factors that look at what Sierra Club is funded to do that particular year in terms of our just availability for fundraising, but also what is a priority for our members generally, and what is the priority for the legislative members as well. So for example, this coming year, we know that clean energy resources and getting clean energy online is going to be a major priority for a lot of members that we've figured out through just our different meetings with them. And so we will be looking out a lot for clean energy permitting and clean energy resources throughout the legislative session, and that will be a major priority that a number of us are working on. But for example, say that there is a bill that is not on our priority bill list, but is one that is still important, we will obviously still advocate for those. So we put out together a priority bill list by the end of March that is posted on our website. And those are priorities that our legislative committee has identified, but those are also just priorities that the environmental community generally have come up with to be very important for the cause here in California. If a bill is not on that list, again, it does not mean that we're not working on it. It just means that it's not getting as much attention from us, but that doesn't mean we haven't written a letter on it. We haven't talked to people about it and things of that nature. We usually ask our members and volunteers to be very involved in the bills that are on our priority bill list, because those are the ones that our legislative committee have identified. Next slide, please. So once our positions are finalized, we advocate. So how do we advocate? We write support and oppose letters for every bill. Those letters are public and they are sent to the committees, and then they're noted in the analysis as well. And that lays out the exact reasons as to why we're supporting or we're opposing a specific measure. There are usually a lot of different organizations on those letters. However, and if there are just one or two organizations, that's just as fine. And it's important to note that in the bill analysis that Sakira talked about, we the list of organizations that are supporting or opposing can get pretty long sometimes. And that's important for purposes of the legislature's own edification, because if they see that there are a number of environmental groups that are in opposition, or a number of environmental individuals who are in opposition to a bill, then they're more likely to scrutinize that bill. And the same goes for support. If there are a number of groups that are in support of the bill that they recognize and are familiar with, then it could be that they feel more comfortable voting for that bill. And so that's very important to make sure that by certain deadlines that you get your letter in to the legislature to make sure that they're aware of kind of the position that you take. Once we submit those letters, we then start lobbying. We then start advocating. And so we talk to the committee about our concerns or our the reasons why they should support the bill. We talk to legislators and their staff who are on those committees, and we argue and make our case as well. We also talk to staff outside of those committees too, to let them know that, hey, this is a major priority for us, or this is something that's going to be coming to the floor. Just be aware of that. Once they pass out of committees, then it's all hands on deck with regards to the floor. We employ our volunteers and our members a lot, and Michael's going to talk a little bit about that in a second, to call in to their assembly member or senator's districts. And we also while we're doing this, we're also in contact with the governor's office to pressure them as well to support the bill and to get his political capital in play if necessary. So we use there are a number of ways that we advocate. We also have an outside game, which is what we call like a media strategy for certain bills as well, which means that we'll ask our members to write letters to the editor, we'll do op-eds, we'll get very involved in different ways outside of the bill so that the general public knows that this bill is of importance for the environmental community and environmental justice community as well. Next slide. And with that, I will pass it over to Michael to talk a little bit about how we promote our legislative efforts as well.
Great, thanks so much, Brandon. So Brandon, Sakira, and Aaron just talked a little bit about all of the efforts that Sierra Club California takes, to lobby on bills, to lobby the legislator, to take positions. So I want to talk a little bit about publicizing those efforts, and that's really important for building our coalition, ensuring our members and supporters are aware of what we're doing across the state. Lots of different groups, other environmental organizations, some advocacy organizations that Brandon and Sakira mentioned, and individuals like you all look to us for leadership on these key issues. So while you guys watching may be a little bit more well-informed about the stance we take on certain issues, a lot of our members and supporters, aren't on this webinar or aren't checking our website as frequently. So it's really important as well that we key them into specific areas of policy that we're prioritizing, which is why at certain points in the legislative process that my colleagues just mentioned, we'll work to publicize how we're engaging in the different parts of those processes. You've probably seen a few of these communications before if you're on this webinar. So our tweets, our action alerts, which are the emails we send out directly to members, our press releases. It's the goal of the communications team and the goal of Sierra Club California more broadly to make sure that our members and the general public know specifically how we're working on an individual bill, why we're working on that bill, what the result of that bill is going to be, etc. Aaron mentioned transparency, which is an important value of ours as well. We're a member-driven organization, and our members help us determine the position we're going to take on bills. We want our members to be aware of the really crucial and oftentimes very difficult work our policy advocates are putting in to make sure that these good bills that we mentioned, like SB 1137, become law, and bad bills that support polluting interests are prevented from passing, which is, again, equally important to protecting the environment. So you can find some updates on these processes in our newsletters as well, which we send out on approximately a monthly basis. Sometimes these newsletters will contain call to actions or other time-sensitive updates on specific legislation or bills, but other times we'll use them as sort of an educational resource to keep you all updated on, why you should care about specific issues, what perhaps a state agency has been up to or not up to about a policy or a bill, and staff updates as well, so you can keep track of our new policy advocates. Like Brandon mentioned, we're having actually a new person start next week, so we're really excited about that. So if you're not already signed up for those, we definitely strongly encourage you to. That's our letter from Sacramento, our Capital Voice, and our Newsom News Now. We've talked a little bit, and I've talked a little bit about what we do at the legislature and how we can influence policy. And now I want to talk just a little bit about what you can do. So member action is really crucial to convincing legislators that a bill should be passed or shouldn't be passed. We're only listened to as Sierra Club California because we represent a really important voting block of constituents. The action alerts that I mentioned, which again are those emails that we send out directly to members asking them to do something, whether it's sending a comment, signing a petition, promoting something on social media, are a really important way that we build awareness of an issue and also build awareness and educate our members of which side environmentalists fall on. So there's lots of obviously disinformation campaigns by polluting interests and dirty dollars to try to try to highlight this bill is good for the environment when it's actually damaging, whatever it is. So really we want to sort of educate folks and make them aware why we're taking these positions. And if enough voters make enough noise about an issue, whether they're calling in, sending a comment, promoting our writings, legislators must listen to them. And it really does make a difference. Recently, I'm sure a few of you have seen, we sent in over 4,000 comments to the Department of Water Resources opposing the construction of the Delta Tunnel. And they definitely took notice of that. That's a major groundswell of support. And had we sent in perhaps 2,000 comments, that might not have been as impactful. But even if you can't send in a comment, any time or energy you can spare, whether it's to call a local elected official, promote an op-ed, anything you can do really does make a difference and directly helps our efforts to lobby legislators and more broadly our mission to protect the environment. We've said multiple times in this webinar, we're a member-led organization and we'd be nothing without the members. You guys really are the ones that make the difference to elected officials. And the fact that our members act on these alerts is also really important. So we have specific groups that we email about individual issues. So we have a group of water activists, energy, air, depending on sort of where you've expressed interest, what newsletters you're signing up for, where you've taken action in the past. And when we send out our action alerts, we rely on you guys to respond and to act. And when we have a really large number of people, of our members, of supporters, and whoever take action on a specific alert or on a specific policy or bill, it also helps inform us about what you all are focused on, what you care about, and in turn, what we should be prioritizing. Like I mentioned, the water, the comments we sent in opposing the Bay Delta and the Delta Tunnel rather, and that was a really, really great showing of support. And all of our members really care about water issues, and that just helps reinforce that notion that that's an important value for Sierra Club, is protecting those ecosystems and safeguarding those communities against overtaxing their water supply. And that is what gives us power, essentially. Ultimately, for all the lobbying and all the advocating we do for the environment, we can't do it without you guys. So that's the biggest part of our communication strategy. And now I'm going to go ahead and hand it back to Brandon to discuss in-district lobbying, which is another part of how our members are involved.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michael. I want to underscore a point that Michael made, which is the volunteer and the groundswell support is very important for our effectiveness here in Sacramento. So we can't we can't be effective unless we have you all supporting us and in your district. And one way that you can do that in the district is through our in-district lobbying program that you will get more information about next week and in February as well. But I wanted to give you all a little bit of a primer today about that program and what it has historically done. So industry lobbying is, as it notes on the slide, one of the most effective ways to volunteer and influence environmental policy within your area, but will have a statewide impact. And so what we did was in 2018 or 2019, we got a few just key districts around the state together and had some volunteers in those districts to get together and essentially go into their legislator offices, meet with their legislators, meet with their staffs, and explain to them why a key policy is important for the local district, but also for the state. And what we found was that was one of the best ways to build community, to make sure that their legislators are aware that their community actually cares about these issues, and to also make sure that you have a rapport with your local legislator. A lot of these legislators are endorsed by Sierra Club California, but then they, lose contact with us after that endorsement process. The in-district lobbying process is one key way that you could keep communication and have a constant presence to that legislator, whether it be a senator or whether it be a assembly member for the state. And so there are 6 keys to in-district lobbying. First is knowing who your legislators are, doing research to find that out. And there is a tool on our website to be able to find that out as well. Then you can get on their mailing list. And so once you're on their mailing list, they usually send out newsletters and just different things about like what they're doing. And a lot of the times you'll see that they have different coffee hours or different happy hours or things of that nature in the district that you can go and identify yourself and explain, hi, I'm so-and-so. I live in the district. I'm a constituent. I'm also a member of Sierra Club. And I want to talk to you about X. Let them know that, like this, why this is important. And then what you would do is you would schedule in-person or virtual meetings specifically on the identified priorities that Sierra Club California has made. And so usually we send about 3 to 5 different priority bills to our members to do in-district lobbying on. And you'll meet with a group of Sierra Club members to coordinate this and prepare, and then go into their office and explain why they should vote for this bill, why they shouldn't vote for this bill, what it means for the districts, things like that. And then what you would do is report back to Sierra Club California staff as to how that meeting went. And then we would help you figure out next steps. And we would also figure out a follow-up as well. There are more intricate, steps in that process that we're excited to talk to you all about. That webinar / more in specific program will be launched in March. And so be on the lookout for that. But yeah, we have a website, where it says learn more about in-district lobbying here. We have a website where you can look for past details on that. It's very important that, again, that you let us know how those conversations went, so we can then hold those legislators accountable to those conversations here in Sacramento when we're doing our work lobbying. That is also very important. And with that, next slide. With that, I want to open it up for Q&A, and how we'll conduct Q&A is by raising your hand, please, and Michael and I will unmute individuals. You can also put your hand, you can also put your question in the chat, and we have a communications staff person, Destiny, who will be monitoring the chat. What we'll do is we'll do a vocal question and then do a chat question. So we'll switch off in that way. But we have about 15 minutes for that. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. And I just wanted to let people know that this will end around 1 p.m. So wanted to flag that for folks. With that, let me go and look into the participants. I can't see who has their hands up for whatever reason. Michael, could you stop sharing? Sorry.
Yep.
Okay, with that, Hoyan, you are up.
I hesitated to raise my hand. It's me again. So, Brandon, it was interesting to hear you saying that when we go meet our legislators in district, we say we're members of the Sierra Club, I've always been so secretive. Don't tell. I mean, everyone knows I'm with the club. But how do you handle this situation? I mean, some of you already know we have some members, they are also with other organizations. And so they go meet the legislators, and then they get into the meeting and they say, wow, we're active members with the, whatever Sierra Club committees, and then started talking about the Brandon. So that is way off, right?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I would say the most important point in those in-district lobbying meetings, and just generally when you're meeting with the legislature in district, is to make sure that you note that you are constituent first. And so noting that you live in the district, this is an issue of importance to you and to your community. And then you could say, I'm also a Sierra Club member. That is important, and that also gives us the ability here again to say, we know our members in your district met with you. We know that this is of importance to them. Therefore, you can't say, oh, you never heard from Sierra Club. I would also note, though, when you're conducting those meetings and you're saying you're a member of Sierra Club, it's important that you espouse the Sierra Club position and not your own position. And if you have your own position and it's not, in coordination with Sierra Clubs, I highly, highly, highly have to ask you that you make that known and say, personally, this is not as a Sierra Club member, but this is my own position. I just want to make that distinction because that's very important. The last thing we need in Sacramento is for them to say, oh, well, we heard from someone in your district that this is their position, and then we just have to correct them. So it's really it's a matter of integrity and it's a matter of honesty. But again, the most important thing you can do is make sure it's known that you're a constituent. Destiny, a chat question. Oh, Destiny not on anymore.
It looks like.
Oh, she's on.
All right, there we go. I'm gonna go with Victoria, who asked a question at the beginning, and she asked, who is responsible for deciding whether a bill is referred to a committee?
Yeah, so that would be the leadership and the rules committees on each side. So on the Senate side, that's the President Pro Tem and the Rules Committee, and then on the Assembly side, that's the Assembly Speaker and the Rules Committee. They are responsible for deciding whether or not a bill is referred to a committee. Whether or not a bill is heard in that committee is up to the chair ultimately. Cool. Jean.
I have a question. I'm sorry, I can't get my video thing going. Our Assemblywoman often doesn't vote, misses votes, or votes after everyone votes, so she has a safe vote. There's a part of me that wants to do a letter to the editor to really advertise that fact that she is not really representing us, because she's not voting on many environmental issues.
Mm-hmm.
But then do I completely blocken my chances of going in to go and meet with her on different issues?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I would say the first point of interaction is always meeting with your legislator first and letting them know your feelings on the matter. So in this case, it sounds like you're disappointed that they're not voting on environmental issues. Having a conversation about that in district is important first, and then I would then elevate to a letter to the editor if the behavior isn't changed after that for whatever reason. But I see the value of doing a letter to the editor at some point. But first, all interaction should be had with the person through a meeting if possible, or with their staff.
And you think, I mean, we always end up meeting with staff, but that's effective enough to meet with staff? Yeah.
Yeah. Staff are required to relay the notes or how that meeting went with the legislator. And so if you're lucky enough to meet with the legislator, like obviously take that chance when you get it. But if you have to meet with staff, make it as efficient and as substantive as possible.
Thank you.
Of course. Destiny.
All right, there we go. Mark O'Connor asked, how do we get to represent Sierra Club with our local elected officials?
Is if just so I make sure I'm aware, how do we get to represent Sierra Club with our local elected officials? I mean, I'm assuming you're a Sierra Club member. That's why you're on this. That's why you're on this webinar. In that case, I would get involved with your local chapter and making sure that they're aware of your interest in wanting to be involved as much as possible. If you're looking specifically for in-district lobbying, that will be through our webinar that will be out in March, and our program deployment essentially out in March. So that's the way that you would get involved there. Thank you. And then I'm going to go to Karen Hansen.
Hold on. Yeah, I introduced a bill to the state of California in November. I found out that the developers were not putting in native plants in my area. And, they take up, this is in Menifee, and they take up lots of acreage. And I did my checking, sure enough, they're not putting in native plants. So I proposed a bill to California to install 70% native plants according to the Smithsonian chickadee study. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a 3-year study done in Washington, D.C. And they found out if you can plant 70%, then you maintain the population of the pollinators. Otherwise, they keep declining. And they've declined about 41% over the last several decades. And right now it's in my senator's office. I wanted to get your input. I want to get your support, because if we can do this on a big scale, that'll save a lot of pollinators.
Thank you for that question, Karen. I'm going to answer the last part of your question first, which is like,
okay.
How does Sierra Club support that type of measure?
Yeah,
that would have to be taken through our legislative committee process, and it sounds like an interesting bill that they'd want to interact with. And so once that bill was introduced by the senator, if they are to introduce it, then we would be able to support that bill. That said, what we could do is, Karen, if you want to send myself and Aaron an email with specifics about that, and also with the senator that you're working on, we could follow up as to the status of like what they're thinking on that bill, and talk with our legislative committee about the possibility about that type of work.
Okay, thank you.
No, of course. Thank you. Yes, Shani?
Margie Hills, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing anybody's name correctly. When will the priority bill list be set?
Thank you. That is set after our March legislative committee meeting, and so it's usually out by the end of March. This year, that meeting is March 18th. So sometime towards the end of March is when the priority bill list will be out. That said, the legislative process doesn't wait for Sierra Club, right, to come out with anything. And so you might have some emails coming from us talking about key bills as early as the beginning of March, which is something that we would note. So the list will be out by the end of March, but start being on the lookout for priority bills in early March. And I'm going to Ian.
Unmute. Thank you. You've talked about how we can advance our Sierra Club lobbying here, which is the main focus, but I'm actually interested in your view of the competition with the other side. I mean, there's obviously a lot of money behind lobbying that the oil industry puts into Sacramento, other polluting industries. They spend millions upon millions of dollars on independent expenditures. And I would really be curious in your viewpoint on how that competition works, what their lobbying looks like, and why it is in a state where we have a Democratic governor and Democratic super majorities in the legislature where this really is still a competitive environment.
Wonderful question. I really appreciate you asking that. The situation with regards to environmental communities and the environmental community in the oil and gas industry when it comes to lobbying is one that I characterize, and I've been quoted as characterizing this in the media as a David versus Goliath situation. I believe between 2018 and 2022, they spent more than, I believe it was 5 or 6 times more than the environmental community lobbying here in Sacramento. And Sierra Club California was actually the largest, the organization with the most amount of money spent, and we didn't even spend close to, I believe, like $500,000 on that, specifically lobbying in Sacramento. So a lot of it comes down to capacity. And so this industry has the ability to only work on one issue, oil and gas issues, but they employ a number of lobbyists and lobbying firms to do their bidding in the legislature. Whereas Sierra Club California, for example, has currently 3 lobbyists who work on every environmental issue that comes across our desk. So it's a matter of capacity, and it's also a matter of it starts in the election process. I'm going to be real. Some legislators take some money from the polluting industry, whereas Sierra Club California, we're not as lucrative in being able to give, or the Sierra Club California PAC isn't as lucrative in being able to give as much money as that industry as well. So that's also an influence first part. What you all could do to help us out with that is, one, be that voice in the district. Because we don't have a lot of money and capacity here in Sacramento, we're working on building that up. We have you all in district to be able to be that voice where necessary. And so it really goes back to you in terms of being involved in your district and helping out and making sure that they're known. And be on the lookout for when those legislators do take that money during their electoral campaigns as well. That's very important. And that's something that I would watchdog as much as possible too. That said, I'm not agnostic to the fact that, again, we just don't have the financial capability as much as this industry does here in Sacramento. But that doesn't mean that we don't have the values or the integrity of our membership. I will tell you now, none of our staff took our jobs at a nonprofit because we're paid well. I'll put it that way. Destiny?
Manny asked, how do you see this year's state budget impacting Sierra Club goals for 2023?
Another amazing question. I've been talking a lot. And so, Aaron, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about 30 by 30 on that. And then Sakira, can you talk a little bit about the equitable building decarb budget? So, Aaron?
Yes. So last year, the budget included roughly $1.5 billion towards programs that would benefit 30 by 30, which is the state's goal to conserve 30% of lands and coastal waters by 2030 to combat the dual biodiversity and climate crises. This year, because of the budget situation, they've proposed significant cuts to some of that funding, including funding that was allocated for this year. While some programs within 30 by 30 were cut closer to like 80 to 90%, other programs, specifically coastal resiliency and efforts to build capacity for local communities to build out their 30 by 30 programs and tribal programs, got cut significantly more. So we are engaged in working with our allies to try to address some of those disproportionate cuts in the budget. But there is still funding allocated to those programs, and there are ongoing efforts to get some of that out despite the budget situation.
Thank you, Aaron. And then Sakira, do you want to talk about the building decarbonization?
Yes, so the Equitable Building Decarbonization Program helps with direct installations of electric appliances for low-income families. It also provides building electrification incentives. And unfortunately, it was reduced by $87 million in the newest updated budget. So we are, making sure that we advocate as much as possible to protect this funding, particularly when we meet with different legislative staff members and legislators. And so we are trying to protect that funding as much as possible.
Thank you. Yeah. Overall, what does the budget cuts mean? Not just in those two areas, those are two priority areas. It just means that we're going to have to do our best to defend those programs that are most beneficial to low income and communities that are most at risk for environmental impacts with regard to climate change. I think that that's important. I want to note that we have 2 minutes left. There's one question in the chat that I wanted to flag. and I lost it because multiple people have said, oh, it was Santiago's question, which is about a scorecard, sorry, that indicates which members take oil money. I didn't bring up the scorecard and I apologize. It just slipped my mind, even though it's like one of our biggest efforts. So at the end of every legislative session, we put together a scorecard detailing how legislators, all 120 of them, fared in that legislative session. It's based on 10 or a number of bills. Usually it's 10, but it could be less than 10, it could be more than 10 bills that Sierra Club identified as most important for the environment, and whether or not they voted with Sierra Club on that issue. So this past year we had 10 bills and we put it out. Usually I believe it was in mid-October, and only 6 legislators got 100%, which is like typical for the course, unfortunately. And then a lot of legislators got 80 and 90%. What does this mean what does this mean for you all and what you can do? This means that you could take this piece of information back to their districts and say, why did you not vote as well as you should have on the environment? Or thank you so much for voting on the environment in this way, shape, and form. It also is a key piece of information when you're doing your endorsement processes as well in the future. So I just wanted to flag that for folks, and you can find that on our website as well. Whether that one thing that isn't noted in there is whether or not the legislator took oil money, but that's because we have a separate report called the Dirty Dollars Report. That indicates who's taken oil money, how much they've taken and whatnot. We haven't put that out primarily because we are still in the process. There was an election, as I'm sure you're aware, and then we also lost a staffer who has done that, but we will be putting that back out earlier this year. So just wanted to flag that. It's 1 o'clock and I recognize that a lot of people have a lot of questions. And so if you could just email myself or Michael with those questions, that would be great. But really appreciate everyone taking the time to hop on today. And Michael, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, thanks again to everybody. Like we said, we couldn't do it without you. I just wanted to remind folks, obviously this was recorded. We're going to be putting it online on our website. So we'll be sharing that link with all of our members, excuse me, in the coming weeks. So be aware for that. So you can look over the slides, look over the discussion. And yeah, just thanks again to everyone for coming, and hopefully we'll do something again like this soon.
Thanks so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks all.
you.
Bye.
Bye.